Lecture 68, Fyodor Dostoevsky.
Lizaveta was standing in the middle of the room with a big bundle in her hands, frozen, staring at her murdered sister, white as a sheet, and as if unable to utter a cry. Seeing him run in, she trembled like a leaf with a faint quivering, and spasms ran across her whole face. She raised her hand, opened her mouth, yet still did not utter a cry. He rushed at her with the axe. She twisted her lips pitifully, as very small children do when they begin to be afraid of something, stare at the thing that frightens them, and are on the point of crying out. And this wretched Lizaveta did not even raise a hand to protect her face. The blow landed directly on the skull with a sharp edge and immediately split the whole upper part of the forehead, almost to the crown. She collapsed. Raskolnikov, utterly at a loss, snatched up her bundle, dropped it again, and ran to the entryway. In this vivid, brilliant, brutal passage, Fyodor Dostoevsky shines the spotlight of his scrutiny on Lizaveta, the helpless victim of Raskolnikov, as he rushes to kill her. Until the final sentence of this passage, virtually all we see filling up the screen of the narrative is the face and body of a young woman who has just seen the freshly murdered body of her sister, who knows that she too is about to be murdered, who quivers like a leaf with that knowledge, and is so paralyzed with terror that she cannot even bring herself to scream before the axe splits her head open. Reading only this passage, we might easily conclude that Raskolnikov is a heartless brute, a bloodthirsty monster, a killing machine. But nothing could be further from the truth. Raskolnikov defies and confounds any simple formula we might use to explain him. At once intellectually detached and emotionally tormented, by turns coldly egotistical and passionately altruistic, he radically challenges our most basic assumptions about what makes a character good or bad, noble or vicious, contemptible or great. Raskolnikov is the inexhaustibly complex hero of one of the greatest novels ever written, Crime and Punishment. By the time Dostoevsky wrote this novel, first published in 1866, he was 45 years old and had lived a life quite as extraordinary as the life of any one of his own characters. Born in Moscow in 1821 to a family of the lower middle class, he found no culture at home and precious little at the boarding school he attended up to age 17, when he was sent to study military engineering in St. Petersburg. But like the young Charles Dickens, he read voraciously whenever he could. And like Dickens again, he made his name as a writer in his early 20s. At 23, he wrote his first novel, Poor Folk, a novel told in letters exchanged between an impoverished, middle-aged copying clerk and the penniless young woman he loves, but eventually loses to the brute who has already seduced her and who buys her into marriage. When a famous critic named Vissarion Belinsky read the book, he declared, "This is the truth of art." Dostoevsky's novel, he said, reveals such secrets of life and characters in Russia as no one before him ever dreamed of. What was new in this work was the depth of sympathy it showed for characters living in poverty and humiliation. As Joseph Frank notes, this early work showed that the realism of the French social novel, as well as of Dickens, was already steering Dostoevsky away from the idealism of the German Romantics and into the fetid, teeming, junk-cluttered slums of St. Petersburg. But Dostoevsky did not stop at slumming. Unlike Nikolai Gogol, who made downtrodden characters the target of ridicule or at best the objects of pity, Dostoevsky wrote with genuine compassion for the poor. Rather than just exhorting the rich and powerful to do something for those humiliated by poverty, oppression, and insult, rather than that, he strove to find some shred of dignity in them, to reveal their inner worth, to be a realist of the soul. Yet even as he made himself the novelist of the poor and the insulted, he had to fight his own battles against debt and oppression. Not long after Poor Folk appeared in 1846, Dostoevsky found himself in debt to an unscrupulous publisher. And just 3 years later, he was arrested for working with a group that planned to publish illegal articles calling for political reform. In the middle of the 19th century, Russia was not only seamed by gaping cracks between the rich and the poor, but also ruled by the reactionary Nicholas I, who had crushed an uprising against him on his very first day as Tsar in December 1825, and thereafter set out to gag every voice of dissent. So in 1849, Dostoevsky was arrested, packed off to prison, and condemned to be shot by a firing squad at the age of 28. Pardoned by the Tsar at the very last minute, he was sent off in chains to 4 years at hard labor in Siberia, then service as a common soldier. If Dickens never forgot his months in a shoeblacking factory, you can bet your life Dostoevsky never forgot his 4 years in a Siberian prison, never forgot the filth, stench, chains, and cockroaches, or the loathing he endured from his low-born fellow convicts. But prison became the crucible in which Dostoevsky reforged his own soul. Almost miraculously, he emerged from it with a renewed faith in the teachings of Christ and the value of common people, even of convicts. Released from prison in 1854, and then from military service in 1859, he returned to St. Petersburg a full 10 years after he left it. There he launched a new journal with his brother Mikhail, published a book about his ordeal in Siberia, The House of the Dead, and then Notes from Underground, a novella expressing the irrational, amoral individuality of its narrator. By 1865, he had reached the height of his powers and needed every ounce of them. He was faced with the death of his brother and his own tubercular wife, whom he had married 7 years before. He was saddled with debt and the burden of supporting various relatives. He was ambushed so often by epileptic seizures that a servant had to watch him. Nevertheless, he contrived to build a masterpiece around a character unprecedented in literature, a humanitarian murderer. To understand this character, we need to know something of the intellectual climate in which Dostoevsky conceived him. While planning this novel, Dostoevsky told his publisher that he meant it as a psychological study of a young man who had submitted to certain strange, incomplete ideas which float on the wind. As Joseph Frank has shown, these strange ideas sprang from the English philosophy called utilitarianism. Launched in the later 18th century by Jeremy Bentham and refitted in the 19th century by John Stuart Mill, utilitarianism made utility the touchstone of moral value. Action is good insofar as it promotes the greatest happiness of the greatest number, or, in Mill's socialist version of the doctrine, promotes the welfare of the people as a whole, including women and workers. Now, imported by Russian intellectuals in the early 1860s, utilitarianism led some radical thinkers to nihilism, the theory that a few privileged individuals may ignore all laws and principles, may nullify all prohibitions to serve the interests of humankind at large. Ultimately, the aims of nihilism were altruistic and humanitarian, for it sought to alleviate human suffering. But since nihilism exempts the privileged individual from moral law, it effectively authorizes something like the Nietzschean Superman, a man guided by reason alone, above and beyond morality or sentiment, undeterred by pity for any poor creature whose death might facilitate his higher aims. Taking dead aim at this radical version of utilitarianism, Dostoevsky casts his novel as a relentlessly searching answer to a gigantic what if. What if a brilliant, sensitive, impoverished young student, a brilliant, sensitive, altruistic, impoverished young student in the grip of these strange, incomplete ideas, actually murdered one or more people? How would a humanitarian murderer conceive his crime, commit it, and then live with the psychological consequences? That is the great question Dostoevsky sets out to answer in the character of Raskolnikov. Midway through the novel, Raskolnikov admits that he has written an article which divides all men into two categories, ordinary and extraordinary. Though ordinary men, he argues, may submit to the law, Extraordinary men like Napoleon have the right to break the law and kill people, even innocent people, for the benefit of humanity at large. But how does Napoleon become the model for an obscure, sickly, impoverished student, a student so poor that he had to leave the university? Early in the novel, we learn what happens just after he leaves a little gold ring with an old woman pawnbroker and gets 2 rubles for it. While drinking tea at a wretched little tavern, he overhears another student talking about this very same pawnbroker as a rich old ailing hag with a younger half-sister who slaves for her, a tall, harried, endlessly compliant spinster named Lizaveta. Since the old woman has left all her money to a monastery, the student that Raskolnikov overhears feels outraged enough to kill her. 100, 1,000 good deeds, he says, could be arranged and set going by the money that old woman has doomed to the monastery. Kill her and take her money so that afterwards, with its help, you can devote yourself to the service of all mankind. What do you think? Wouldn't thousands of good deeds make up for one tiny little crime? And what does the life of this stupid, consumptive, and wicked old crone mean in the general balance? No more than the life of a louse. Here's the case for humanitarian murder. It might also be called Napoleonic murder. The overheard student would never dream of actually committing such a murder, as he hastens to say when asked. But Raskolnikov dares to put nihilistic theory into practice. Driven by satanic pride, as Dostoevsky called it in his notes for the novel, Raskolnikov strikes without mercy. And late in the novel, he tells Sonia, the poor young woman who desperately loves him, he tells Sonia that he killed the old woman in order to become a Napoleon. If Napoleon had to murder such a woman for the sake of his career, says Raskolnikov, he would have done it without a pang. Echoing the overheard student, he bluntly adds, I only killed a louse, Sonia, a useless, nasty, pernicious louse. He aimed, he says, to relieve his poor widowed mother and sister from the burden of having to support him at the university. He would use the old woman's money, he says, to set up a whole new career entirely and start out on a new independent path. Even without further probing Raskolnikov's state of mind, we can already begin to see the gaping holes in his argument. He says nothing at all in this passage about his killing of poor Lizaveta, and the humanitarian motive originally cited to justify murder has shrunk to mere careerism, the selfish urge to make one's own way in the world. Yet in spite of what he tells Sonia, Raskolnikov has already come to see that killing has not made him a Napoleon, that Napoleon would never creep under an old woman's bed to find her money, and that he himself is a louse, perhaps even more vile and nasty than the louse I killed, as he says to himself. For all his pretensions to Napoleonic superiority, for all his claims to be above the law, Raskolnikov's crime leaves him racked with self-loathing, the sequel to the agonizing ambivalence that racked him before the crime. In the very first chapter, he goes to the pawnbroker pretending that he wants to pawn a silver watch, but he actually wants to stake out the scene of the crime that he's planning, to find out where she hides her money and when she might be alone. Yet no sooner does he leave her flat, without learning all that he wants to know, then he finds himself utterly repelled by his own plan. And the very next day, after waking up from a fearful dream, he begs God to deliver him from the nightmare of his own intentions. Lord, he prays, show me my way. I renounce this cursed dream of mine. But Raskolnikov's urge to renounce his murderous intentions cannot withstand the pressure of what he takes to be fate. When he goes to the Haymarket, he overhears Lizaveta talking to a huckster and his wife and agreeing to see them at 7 o'clock the following night. He thereby acquires a captivating piece of information, that tomorrow, at exactly 7 o'clock in the evening, Lizaveta, the old woman's sister and only companion, would not be home, and that therefore at exactly 7 o'clock in the evening the old woman would be left at home, alone. A sense of destiny now seizes Raskolnikov's will. Though he prides himself on his special exemption from all the rules and regulations that bind ordinary men, all at once he feels that he no longer had any freedom either of mind or of will, and that everything had suddenly and finally been decided. Ironically, though, Raskolnikov misses the fateful hour of 7. Because of some miscalculations, he reaches the old woman's flat a full half hour late, which gives Lizaveta time to return and find him with her freshly murdered sister. So Lizaveta too must be murdered, lest she live to tell what she saw. Now the ironies multiply. Having taken the purse that hung by a string from the old woman's neck, having filled his pockets with trinkets hastily snatched from under a big red box under her bed, Raskolnikov just barely escapes detection as he scrambles out of the old woman's building. Back in his own tiny garret, he stuffs his loot into a hole that he finds behind the tattered wallpaper, worries ineffectually about what to do with his blood-stained clothes, and finally collapses on his sofa, only to be awakened by a violent knocking at his door and a summons to the police office. At once he concludes that he's already been found out. "I'll go in," he says to himself as he climbs to the fourth floor office. "I'll walk in, fall on my knees, and tell them everything." But it turns out that he hasn't been summoned for the murder. He'd been summoned for non-payment of a debt, for his failure to pay an IOU of 115 rubles made out 9 months previous to his landlady. As a result, he feels a tremendous sense of joy and relief. And after describing himself as sick and impoverished and wholly dependent on his mother and sister, he readily persuades the police to give him more time to pay off the debt. At this point, the novel begins to look like the sort of detective story in which the criminal outwits the police. While at the police station, in fact, Raskolnikov learns that 2 other men have been arrested for the murder, and one of them, a house painter named Nikolai, will later confess to it. But Raskolnikov is no ordinary criminal bent on hiding his tracks. He's a bundle of contradictions. Originally, Dostoevsky planned his novel as a first-person confession made by the murderer. And in the novel itself, Raskolnikov's urge to confess his crime rivals his determination to hide it. Just after finishing his business with the police, he feels an almost irresistible impulse to tell the superintendent all about the murder and to show him all the things he had hidden in his garret. But when the police ask a few questions about what he did the day before, Raskolnikov is freshly terrified of exposure. Fearing that his room might already have been searched, he rushes back to it, takes the old woman's purse and the trinkets from the hole in the corner, stuffs them into his pockets, and goes out to get rid of them. Though he first thinks of simply throwing them into the Ekaterinsky Canal, he can't see how to do that without drawing attention. So he finds his way to a deserted lot where he stashes the loot in a small hole and then covers it with a big heavy stone. "Now," he says joyfully to himself, "the traces are covered." But his joy soon dissolves in the realization that he has just abandoned the very purpose for which he committed his terrible crime. If indeed this whole thing was done consciously and not foolheadedly, he says to himself, if you indeed had a definite and firm objective, then how is it that so far you have not even looked into the purse and do not know what you've actually gained? Or for what you accepted all these torments and started out on such a mean, nasty, vile business? The intellectual murderer, the supremely rational criminal, suddenly realizes that he does not know why he committed his crime. He cannot even say how much he has enriched himself, let alone how much he will benefit humanity at large. And his incapacity to grasp his own motive, to explain his own crime to himself, sharpens his sense of isolation. He has a mother and sister who love him dearly, and also a devoted friend, a fellow student named Razumikin. But as he sits in the police station, he realizes that he cannot tell any one of them what he truly feels, and he is gripped by a sense of tormenting, infinite solitude. Later on, when his mother and sister come from the country to see him after many months of separation, he tells them, "We'll have time to talk all we want." But he knows that's a lie. He knows that not only would he never have the chance to talk all he wanted, but that it was no longer possible for him to talk at all with anyone about anything ever. Paradoxically, however, Raskolnikov speaks at length to many others in this novel, above all to the man from whom he has every reason to hide as much as possible, Porfiry Petrovitch, the police investigator. Porfiry is shrewd, penetrating, disarmingly friendly, and relentless. He's a little like Peter Falk's trench-coated Columbo in his offhand way of throwing out questions that pretend to be trivial or incidental, but can detonate like depth charges in the mind of a suspect. It's Porfiry who questions Raskolnikov about his article, the article that divides men into ordinary and extraordinary, and argues that extraordinary men have the right to break the law for a higher purpose. After chatting about the article with Raskolnikov, having what sounds like a purely intellectual discussion of its ideas, Porfiry begs to ask one more little question, what he calls a playful idea, a psychological idea. When you were writing your little article, he says with a chuckle, surely you couldn't have failed to regard yourself, say, just the tiniest bit, as one of the extraordinary people? When Raskolnikov spitefully admits it's quite possible, Porfiry then continues, and if so, can it be that you yourself would venture, say, for the furtherance of all mankind, to step over the obstacle, well, for instance, to kill and rob? Porfiry winks and silently laughs as he says this, but for Raskolnikov, it's no laughing matter. If I did those things, he says, I would certainly not tell you. But by this time, Raskolnikov knows what Porfiry's wink signifies. It signifies that Porfiry knows and is ready to wait until Raskolnikov finally sees that he must confess. When Dostoevsky was planning this novel, he told his publisher that he meant to explore the psychology of guilt, to consider the idea that the legal punishment inflicted for a crime intimidates a criminal infinitely less than lawmakers think, partly because he himself morally demands it. Another way of putting this is what Raskolnikov says when Porfiry asks him about the conscience of the murderous thief, whoever he may be. Whoever has a conscience can suffer, says Raskolnikov, if he acknowledges his error. It's a punishment for him on top of hard labor. Having both a conscience and a keenly sensitive heart, Raskolnikov suffers throughout this novel, in part because he feels so keenly the sufferings of others, especially of mistreated young women. For in spite of his sense of isolation and his Napoleonic pretensions to exemption from moral laws, and in spite of his own desperate poverty, Raskolnikov feels bound to comfort the afflicted. Seeing a drunken young girl in a torn dress collapse on a seat as he walks along a boulevard, he attacks the dandy that he thinks has seduced her and gives a policeman 20 kopecks, just about the last of his money, to find her a cab. Shortly before, in a tavern, he's met a hopeless drunk named Marmeladov, who has been recently fired from his job as a government clerk and has squandered all his earnings on booze. Though he clings to respectability by buttoning the only remaining button on his ragged dress coat, and though he prides himself on being married to the well-educated daughter of an officer, he himself admits that he's a worthless husband. His consumptive wife, Katerina, and their 4 hungry children live in just one part of a cold, cluttered, and squalid room. And they're so desperate that at one point Katerina goads their pretty 18-year-old daughter, Sonia, to go out and sell her body, which she does. Hearing all this, and then returning with Marmeladov to his wretched flat, Raskolnikov gives the family most of what little money he has. And later, when Marmeladov is fatally struck by a carriage, Raskolnikov desperately summons a doctor, orders the unconscious man carried to his lodgings, watches him die in the very act of begging forgiveness from Sonia, and then gives Katerina 20 rubles for the funeral, all the money that his own mother has recently sent to him. 2 things spring from Raskolnikov's heartfelt response to Marmeladov's fatal injury. First, he decides not to do what he had resolved to do just before he finds Marmeladov bleeding to death. That is, he decides against turning himself in. There is life, he says to himself. Was I not alive just now? My life hasn't died with the old crone. Secondly, his generosity wins him the profound appreciation of Sonia, who gives herself wholeheartedly to the task of keeping him spiritually, emotionally, and physically alive. Though desperately poor and driven to harlotry, Sonia becomes for Raskolnikov even more important than his sister Dunya, whose welfare he is fiercely determined to protect. Dunya and Sonia both touch his heart because he is a murderer with chivalric impulses. He cannot bear to see ladies in distress. He cannot bear to see a drunken young girl with a ripped dress sitting on a public seat. Nor can he bear to see his sister marry a man that she does not love. Along with her mother, Dunya has come to St. Petersburg not only to see Raskolnikov, but also to marry a wealthy lawyer named Luzhin, who is planning to open a law firm in the city, and who has offered a job to Raskolnikov, since law is what he's been studying. But Raskolnikov will have none of this plan. It infuriates him to think that Dunya would sell her soul for a loveless marriage, which to him is no better than harlotry, and he cannot bear the idea that Dunya would thus sacrifice herself for the sake of his own advancement. In Raskolnikov's opinion, Dunya's life with Mr. Luzhin would be no better than Sonia's life as a harlot. Just think about this. In Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, you remember, Charlotte Lucas feels compelled to choose between genteel poverty and the material comforts of a loveless marriage. In the eyes of Raskolnikov, Dunya and Sonia are both being made to choose between destitution and prostitution, unless he finds a third alternative for them, which he does. He not only prevents Dunya's marriage to Luzhin and steers her instead to his friend Razumikin, he also comes to cherish Sonia as the only one who can save him from madness and suicidal despair. In one crucial scene, he goes to visit Sonia because he needs her as much as she needs him. Nauseated by her own harlotry, Sonia is also tortured by the thought that her consumptive mother will soon die, that her little siblings may be thrown on the street, and that her sister Polenka may have to sell her body too. Nonetheless, she offers Raskolnikov what Dostoevsky himself discovered in The Misery of Siberia, the gift of faith. Sonia actually gives Raskolnikov a copy of the New Testament that had been brought to her by Lizaveta, the very woman Raskolnikov killed. Lizaveta was Sonia's friend, and Sonia had a requiem service for her. Now Sonia and Raskolnikov reenact that service as Sonia reads aloud, at his insistence, the story of how Christ raised Lazarus from the dead. As she finishes reading the story, we catch the two of them together in a strikingly cinematic moment that is also, to my mind, a moment of epiphany, of almost supernatural revelation. Here's the text. The candle end had long been burning out in the bent candlestick, casting a dim light in this destitute room upon the murderer and the harlot strangely come together over the reading of the eternal book. Not long after, Raskolnikov confesses to Sonia that he has murdered both the old woman and Lizaveta. At the moment of confession, he sees in Sonia's face the face of Lizaveta, the same look of helpless, childish terror that gripped the face of Lizaveta just before the axe split her head open. But Sonia does not reject him. She falls on her knees before him, then jumps up, throws her arms around him, and declares that she will never leave him. "I'll follow you," she says. "I'll follow you wherever you go." And indeed she does, after Raskolnikov finally gives himself up to the police. Sentenced to 8 years of penal servitude in Siberia, he asks himself why he should go on living, why he does not kill himself. Sonia gives him the answer. A year into his sentence, she has to stop seeing him for a while because she's sick. But when she appears one day at his worksite, all well again, he flings himself at her feet and weepingly clutches her knees. They wanted to speak, we are told, but could not. Tears stood in their eyes. They were both pale and thin, but in those pale, sick faces, there already shone the dawn of a new future, of a complete resurrection into a new life. They were resurrected by love. The heart of each held infinite sources of life for the heart of the other. Dostoevsky knew only too well what he meant here. He himself had survived the ordeal of prison, had returned from what he called the house of the dead, and had risen to new greatness in the masterpieces he wrote during the last 2 decades of his life. Crime and Punishment is a story of murder and then anguish and suffering in the mind of the murderer. but it is ultimately a story of regeneration, a timeless expression of Dostoevsky's faith in the indestructible resilience of the human soul.